The Gilded Cage was not merely a restaurant. It was a silent theater of power, a sanctuary built of marble and hushed secrets on the 57th floor overlooking Central Park. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the scent of old money, truffles, and an unspoken code of conduct that hung between the tables like invisible velvet ropes. Chandeliers, vast and intricate, dripped crystal light from the vaulted ceilings, not to illuminate, but to intimidate, casting the faces of titans and heiresses in a soft, reverential glow. The carpet, a plush crimson so deep it seemed to absorb all sound, muffled the footsteps of the staff, rendering them ghosts in service to the living. Each table was an island, separated by enough space to ensure that a deal worth a small nation's GDP could be made without the slightest risk of being overheard. The distant, muted symphony of New York City's traffic was the only reminder of a world outside these walls, a world that operated on entirely different principles, a world that the patrons of the Gilded Cage had successfully conquered and left far below them. In this gilded arena, Elara Vance moved with a practiced, almost supernatural grace. To the diners, she was a fleeting impression of crisp white linen and quiet efficiency, a pair of hands that refilled a water glass without a ripple or replaced a fork without a sound. Her uniform was immaculate, a stark black and white canvas against the room's opulent golds and reds, designed to make her blend into the shadows. She was 27, but her eyes held a weariness that belonged to someone much older, a quiet sorrow that was carefully tucked away behind a mask of professional neutrality. She performed a silent ballet of service, navigating the treacherous currents of ego and expectation with a precision born of desperation. Every movement was economical, every nod deferential, every smile a carefully calibrated instrument of appeasement. She was invisible, and in this place, invisibility was a survival mechanism. The patrons did not want to see a person, they wanted a function, an extension of their own will, and Elara had learned to perform that role flawlessly, a specter in the grand opera of wealth. But beneath the starched apron and the serene facade, a different person existed, a mind that was anything but invisible. As she poured a 1982 Chateau Margaux for a hedge fund manager, her thoughts were not on the wine's bouquet, but on the intricate legal arguments of securities law. Her memory, a vast and perfectly organized library, held the precise wording of SEC regulations, the landmark cases that defined corporate ethics, and the complex architecture of hostile takeovers. This knowledge was a phantom limb, a constant, aching reminder of a life that had been stolen from her. In quiet moments, she could still feel the weight of a Columbia Law textbook in her hands, could still hear the proud, booming voice of her father explaining the beauty of an ethical business model. He had been a software engineer, a brilliant and kind man who believed technology should serve humanity. He had built his company from the ground up, not as a vehicle for wealth, but as a testament to innovation and integrity, a legacy he had hoped to share with his daughter. That legacy now existed only in the fractured memories of a man confined to a hospital bed, his brilliant mind shattered by a debilitating stroke. The stroke had not been a random act of biology, it had been the direct, brutal consequence of financial violence. Her father's small, ethical startup had been devoured in a predatory hostile takeover, a meticulously planned corporate assassination that had left him ruined, his life's work dismantled and sold for parts. Elara had been forced to drop out of law school, just one semester shy of graduating with top honors, to become his full-time caregiver. The job at the Gilded Cage, with its grueling hours and soul-crushing servility, was the only thing that kept them afloat, the only way to pay for the endless cascade of medical bills that arrived each month, like clockwork. Her motivation was not ambition or greed. It was the fierce, unwavering love for the man who had taught her the meaning of justice, a concept that now seemed like a cruel joke whispered in the halls of power she now served. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. A clash between the quiet dignity of a forgotten prodigy and the deafening arrogance of a man who believed the world, and everyone in it, could be bought. The gilded cage was about to be rattled, its silent theater turned into a courtroom, where the verdict would be delivered not by a judge, but by the quiet waitress no one had ever bothered to see. The shift in the room's atmosphere was palpable, a subtle drop in pressure that announced the arrival of a predator. Alistair Finch did not simply enter a room, he consumed it. He was a man sculpted from arrogance and tailored Italian silk, his presence radiating a cold, frictionless power that made even the other titans in the room seem smaller. The maitre d', a man who regularly greeted senators and billionaires with unflappable poise, suddenly adopted a posture of anxious servitude, his smile tightening at the edges. Finch strode to his reserve table, the best in the house, with a young, eager-looking analyst trailing in his wake like a pilot fish. He did not acknowledge the staff, his gaze sweeping over them as if they were part of the decor. To him, they were not people, but objects, functional pieces of a world designed for his comfort and amusement, and their existence registered only in their utility to him. Ilara felt a familiar knot of ice form in her stomach as she was assigned his table. She had served men like Finch before, men whose wealth had corroded their humanity, leaving behind only an insatiable appetite for more. He settled into his chair, a king ascending his throne, and began to hold court for his young associate. He spoke in a loud, declarative tone, ensuring those at nearby tables could hear the casual mention of nine-figure deals and corporate conquests. He was teaching, but it was not a lesson in business, it was a lesson in dominance. He waved away the menu Ilara presented without a glance, ordering for both himself and the analyst in a dismissive tone. He then launched into a self-congratulatory monologue about a recent acquisition, a story designed to showcase his own ruthless genius and the supposed weakness of his opponents. As Ilara stood patiently by the table, waiting to take their full order, the words Finch used began to slice through the air, each one a familiar term from her past life. He spoke of leveraged buyouts, of poison pills and golden parachutes, using the language of corporate warfare with a swaggering, imprecise bravado. He was explaining these concepts to the analyst, but his performance was for himself, a reinforcement of his own narrative as a master of the universe. He was flaunting his knowledge, using complex jargon as a bludgeon to impress and intimidate. A cruel smile played on his lips as he saw the look of awe on the young man's face. He was completely, blissfully unaware that the silent waitress standing just a few feet away, the woman he had not even deemed worthy of eye contact, understood the legal and ethical nuances of his anecdote with a clarity that would have terrified him. The performance reached its crescendo. Finch paused, a predator savoring the moment before the kill. He turned his cold, reptilian gaze on Ilara for the first time. The shift was so sudden, so jarring, that it felt like a physical blow. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick, paper-banded stack of $100 bills. He tossed it onto the table, the sound a dull, obscene thud on the fine linen. $10,000. He leaned back, a smug, contemptuous smirk spreading across his face. He looked from Ilara to his analyst. "Watch," his expression said. "Everyone is a commodity. Their loyalty is for sale." He then spoke to Ilara, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "I will give you this $10,000 in cash right now if you walk over to your manager and tell him exactly what you think of him. Tell him he is an incompetent fool. Humiliate him. Do it, and the money is yours." For a long moment, the world seemed to freeze. The clinking of silverware, the murmur of distant conversations, the entire symphony of the gilded cage faded into a dull, roaring silence in Ilara's ears. The stack of crisp bills sat on the table, a monument to the man's casual cruelty, a symbol of his belief that everything and everyone had a price. His offer was not just an insult, it was a desecration of everything she was fighting for. That money could pay for 3 months of her father's specialized care. It could ease the crushing weight of debt that sat on her chest every single night, but as she looked at the cash, her mind did not see relief. Instead, a crystal-clear image flooded her consciousness. Her father, propped up in his sterile white bed, his eyes, once so full of life and brilliance, now clouded with a permanent, heartbreaking confusion. The man offering her this bribe did not know he was dangling a cure in front of a victim of his own forgotten poison. A fury, cold and pure and silent, began to solidify in her veins, turning her fear into steel and her despair into a weapon. Her breathing became slow and controlled, her hands steady. She lifted her gaze from the money and met Alistair Finch's eyes, and for the first time that night, he saw not a waitress, but a judge. The silence that followed his offer was not empty. It was a vacuum, pulling all the air and sound from the grand dining room into a single, dense point of tension centered on their table. Ilara's gaze remained fixed on the stack of bills, not with desire, but with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a toxic specimen. Inside her, the carefully constructed walls of professional servitude began to crack, not with a violent explosion, but with the slow, inexorable pressure of a glacier. The image of her father's face, pale against a hospital pillow, superimposed itself over the green and white of the currency. Each bill was a fresh insult, a new layer of desecration upon the memory of a man who had built his life on integrity. A coldness, sharper and more profound than any winter wind, began to seep into her bones, a glacial fury that did not burn, but instead froze her emotions into a diamond-hard resolve. Her posture, which moments before had been a study in deferential subtlety, underwent a transformation so minute it was almost imperceptible, yet it changed the entire dynamic of the space around her. Her spine straightened, not in defiance, but in alignment, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders rather than placed upon them. Alistair Finch watched her, his lips curled in a self-satisfied smirk. He interpreted her stillness as the silent calculation of a simple mind weighing greed against fear. He saw a common waitress, dazzled by a sum of money that likely represented half her annual earnings, wrestling with the pathetic dilemma of her menial existence. He leaned back in his chair, a theatrical gesture of patience, and exchanged a knowing glance with his young analyst. The glance was a lesson in itself, a silent lecture on the base, predictable nature of the lower classes. He was a puppeteer, and he believed he could see the strings attached to every person in the room, including the motionless woman before him. He anticipated the flicker of avarice in her eyes, the nervous lick of her lips, the eventual, inevitable capitulation. The world, in his experience, was a simple machine governed by the levers of fear and desire, and he was a master of both. He was utterly unprepared for a response that operated outside that binary, a response that came from a place he could not comprehend, a world he did not even know existed within the confines of her simple black and white uniform. When Ilara finally lifted her head, the change in her eyes was so profound that it caused Finch to physically recoil, his smirk faltering for the first time. The weary, neutral gaze of the servant was gone, replaced by an unnerving clarity, a focused, analytical light that was both ancient and piercing. It was the look of a scholar, a jurist, a predator, who had just identified its prey. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, nor was it laced with anger. It was calm, measured, and carried a resonant authority that cut through the restaurant's hushed ambiance like a surgeon's scalpel. It was a voice that did not belong there, a voice from a courtroom or a lecture hall, and its effect was immediate and devastating. The analyst, who had been watching his boss with rapt admiration, froze, his jaw slackening. At a nearby table, a conversation about market futures sputtered into silence. Ilara's words were directed at Finch, but they commanded the attention of everyone within earshot, a sudden shift in the room's power dynamics that was as undeniable as a change in gravity. She did not address the insulting offer of money. To do so would have been to validate it. Instead, she went to the heart of his arrogance, to the intellectual performance he had just concluded. "Sir," she began, her tone even and dispassionate, "your understanding of a leveraged buyout is as flawed as your understanding of human decency." The words landed in the opulent room with the force of a physical blow, The analyst's eyes widened in a mixture of terror and disbelief. Finch's face, which had been a mask of smug amusement, began to crumble, the expression shifting through confusion, to indignation, to the first flicker of a deep, narcissistic rage. He opened his mouth to speak, to unleash the torrent of abuse he reserved for underlings who dared to forget their place. But Alara did not give him the chance. She had seized control of the conversation, and she was not about to relinquish it. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of legal analysis that had lain dormant for years, was now fully awake and singing with a terrible, beautiful precision. "What you just described to your associate," she continued, her voice never rising, her gaze locked on his, "is not just a textbook example of a hostile takeover. It dangerously skirts the disclosure requirements mandated by SEC regulations 13D and 14D. Specifically, your boast about accumulating a 5.1% stake in that software company through a series of shell corporations without filing the necessary Schedule 13D within the 10-day window constitutes a clear violation. You speak of it as a clever strategy, but a federal prosecutor would call it a deliberate attempt to manipulate the market by concealing your position as you prepared your tender offer." The precision of her language was staggering. She used no slang, no emotional adjectives. It was a purely clinical, legal dissection of his self-aggrandizing anecdote, delivered with the cold, irrefutable authority of a law review article. The air around the table grew thick and heavy, charged with the electricity of a confrontation that had escalated beyond a simple insult into a public intellectual execution. Finch was rendered speechless, his mind struggling to process the assault. This was not supposed to happen. The waitress, the invisible functionary, was speaking a language he believed was his exclusive domain, and she was speaking it with a fluency that dwarfed his own clumsy performative use of jargon. The analyst stared at Alara, his expression shifting from shock to a dawning, horrified respect. He was a recent MBA graduate from Wharton, and he recognized the absolute, unassailable correctness of her analysis. He had felt a vague unease at Finch's story, but he had lacked the expertise or the courage to question it. Now this woman, this waitress, was laying it bare for all to see, exposing the rot beneath the gilded surface of his mentor's business acumen. He could feel the blood draining from his own face, realizing he was a witness to the public humiliation of one of the most powerful and vindictive men in New York City. Alara was not finished. Her mind was racing, connecting disparate pieces of information with a speed and clarity that felt like coming home after a long exile. She pressed her advantage, her voice remaining a calm, level instrument of intellectual demolition. "Furthermore, your casual mention of a golden parachute for the outgoing CEO, framed as a generous act, would likely be scrutinized as an inducement intended to breach his fiduciary duty to the shareholders during the tender offer phase, a potential violation of the Williams Act. You are not a master of corporate warfare, Mr. Finch. You're simply a man who has become so accustomed to his opponents, fear that you have forgotten the rules of the game you claim to have mastered." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle into the profound silence that now engulfed their table. She had not merely corrected him, she had stripped him of his narrative, exposed his persona as a genius as a fraudulent costume, and she had done it in front of his protégé. The spell was broken. Alistair Finch's face, now a mottled canvas of red and white, contorted into a mask of pure fury. The shock had given way to a volcanic, narcissistic rage. He had not been this thoroughly dismantled, this publicly neutered, since he was a child. To be undone by a titan of industry, a rival CEO, would have been a wound to his pride. To be intellectually vivisected by a waitress was an existential threat. It was an inversion of the natural order of his universe. He slammed his fist on the table, the silverware jumping with a sharp, violent clatter that made the analyst flinch. The sound echoed in the silent room, a crude primal roar in a place that valued silent, civilized power. His voice, when he finally found it, was a low, venomous snarl, barely recognizable as human speech. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he hissed, his eyes burning with a hatred that was almost pure. He did not wait for an answer. He raised his hand, snapping his fingers with a vicious crack in the direction of the maitre d', who was already rushing toward the table. his face a portrait of professional panic. "This thing," Finch spat, gesturing at Alara as if she were a piece of filth on his shoe, "is fired. Get her out of my sight. Now." The manager, a man named Julian who had always treated Alara with a distant but professional respect, arrived at the table, his eyes wide with alarm. He looked from Finch's apoplectic face to Alara's unnervingly calm one, a man caught in the crossfire of a war he did not understand. He knew Finch's reputation. He was a man who could destroy a business, a career, a life with a single phone call, and he would do it for far less than this. Julian's survival instincts took over, overwhelming any sense of loyalty or fairness. He turned to Alara, his expression a miserable mix of apology and fear. "Alara," he began, his voice trembling slightly, I'm going to have to ask you to collect your things. Please, just come with me." There was no argument, no defense. The verdict had been delivered by a man who was judge, jury, and executioner in this gilded kingdom. Alara simply nodded, a single, slow inclination of her head. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a scene from a movie. The humiliation of being fired, of being escorted out like a common criminal, was nothing compared to the quiet, triumphant hum of her own mind. For the first time in years, she had used her greatest weapon, the intellect her father had so carefully nurtured. She had spoken truth to power, and the consequences, however dire, felt secondary to that single, liberating act. She turned, her back straight, and began to walk away from the table, leaving Alistair Finch to stew in the ruins of his own arrogance. As she followed the maître d' through the maze of tables, she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her back. The hushed whispers started almost immediately, a wave of speculation and judgment rippling through the room of power brokers. She did not look back. She kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, her steps measured and even. As she passed the bar, Finch's voice cut through the air one last time, a final, poisoned dart aimed at her retreating back. "People like you should learn their place," he snarled, his voice loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. The words were meant to be her epitaph in this world, a final branding of her as an insignificant nothing who had dared to step out of line. But to Alara, the words were a gift. They were a perfect, crystalline distillation of his entire worldview, the very philosophy that had allowed him to ruin men like her father without a second thought. It was not an insult, it was a confession. The heavy, ornate doors of the gilded cage swung shut behind her, the soft click of the latch severing her connection to that world. She stood on the sidewalk of 57th Street, the cool night air a shock against her skin. The cacophony of Manhattan traffic, the blare of horns, and the wail of a distant siren rushed in to fill the silence. For a moment, the full weight of her situation crashed down upon her. She had no job. The medical bills for her father's care were sitting on her small kitchen table, a relentless, ticking clock. The $10,000 that had seemed like an insult now felt like a lifeline she had just cut. A wave of despair, cold and nauseating, washed over her, and her knees felt weak. She had won a moral victory, a fleeting moment of intellectual triumph, but in the real world, the world of rent and prescriptions, Alistair Finch had won. He was still in that warm, opulent room, and she was out on the cold street, unemployed and alone. She leaned against the cold stone of the building, closing her eyes and taking a deep, shuddering breath. The city lights blurred behind her eyelids. The image of her father returned, not frail in his bed, but as he once was, vibrant, laughing, his eyes full of passion as he explained the elegant code of his latest software project. She remembered his words, a mantra from her childhood. "Justice is not a destination, Alara. It is a direction. It is the framework upon which all worthy things are built." In that moment, something inside her shifted. The despair did not vanish, but it was consumed by a different fire, the same cold, clean fury from before, now focused and honed into a singular purpose. Finch's final words echoed in her mind. People like you should learn their place. He was right. Her place was not as a silent, invisible servant. Her place was as an advocate, a defender, the person her father had raised her to be. Then, another piece of the evening's events clicked into place, a detail that had been submerged beneath the immediate drama. During his boastful monologue, Finch had mentioned the name of the primary shell corporation he used to orchestrate the takeover he was describing. He had said it with a flourish, a throwaway detail meant to add a layer of authenticity to his story. The name was Apex Holdings. A jolt, electric and sharp, shot through Alara's entire body. Apex Holdings. It was not a random name. It was a ghost from her past, a name she had seen 100 times on the legal documents that had documented the hostile takeover of her father's company, Innovate Dynamics. She had spent weeks poring over those filings, trying to understand the complex legal machinery that had chewed up her family's life and spat it out. The realization was a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. This was not a random encounter. The arrogant, cruel billionaire who had just humiliated and fired her was not just another titan of industry. He was the architect of her family's ruin. He was the man responsible for the stroke that had stolen her father's mind. The universe had not just presented her with a random injustice, it had delivered her nemesis directly to her, gift-wrapped in his own hubris. The rage and grief and helplessness she had carried for 3 long years coalesced into a single, brilliant point of clarity. This was no longer about a lost job or a wounded pride. This was about justice. This was about reclaiming a legacy. The fight was not over, it had just begun. Her hands, which had been trembling with shock and despair just moments before, were now perfectly steady. She pulled her worn smartphone from her apron pocket, her movements precise and deliberate. She ignored the missed calls from her landlord and the notifications from the pharmacy. Her fingers flew across the screen, her muscle memory navigating to her contacts list, a list she hadn't truly used in years. She scrolled past the numbers for temp agencies and restaurant suppliers, down into the archives of her past life. She found the name she was looking for, a name that felt like a relic from another civilization, Professor Albright. He had been her mentor at Columbia Law, a titan of corporate ethics who had seen in her a once-in-a-generation legal mind. He had been devastated when she'd dropped out, begging her to find a way to stay. She hadn't spoken to him since. She stared at the name on the screen, the last bridge to the person she used to be. A profound sense of purpose settled over her, a calm that felt more powerful than any rage she had ever known. She was no longer Elara Vance, the waitress. She was Elara Vance, the daughter of a man who deserved justice. She was the only person on Earth who knew Alistair Finch's greatest vulnerability, his past. He had underestimated her, seen her as nothing more than a part of the scenery. He could not possibly imagine that the scenery was about to become the prosecution. She pressed the call button, the phone cool against her ear. As the line began to ring, she looked up at the glittering towers of Manhattan, no longer seeing them as symbols of a world that had excluded her, but as a battlefield. The gilded cage had been opened, not for her to escape, but for her to return with an army of facts and a sword of truth. The fury that had solidified in her veins was no longer a defensive shield. It was now the fuel for a meticulously planned offensive. The humiliation she had endured was not a defeat, but a catalyst, the spark that had reignited a fire she thought had been extinguished forever. Alistair Finch had made a critical, fatal error. He had assumed his power was absolute, his wealth an impenetrable fortress. He failed to understand that the most dangerous opponent is the one with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Standing on that cold New York sidewalk, stripped of her job but armed with a terrible truth, Elara knew her place. Her place was to be the instrument of his downfall, the ghost of a past crime he had long forgotten, returned to collect a debt that could only be paid in the currency of justice. The game was afoot, and he would never see her coming. She envisioned the path ahead, a dark and treacherous road paved with legal documents, financial statements, and the carefully hidden secrets of a corporate empire. It would be a daunting task, a David and Goliath struggle against a man with limitless resources and an army of lawyers. But she had something Finch could never buy: a righteous cause and a mind forged in the very laws he had so flagrantly broken. The image of her father in the hospital bed was no longer a source of pain, but a beacon, a constant reminder of the stakes. She was not seeking revenge in the heat of passion. She was preparing to prosecute a case with the cold, dispassionate precision of the law itself. The years she had spent feeling helpless and invisible were over. Those years had been a period of dormancy, a time of gathering strength, and now she was ready to act. The phone continued to ring in her ear, each tone a drumbeat marking the start of a new chapter in her life. She pictured Professor Albright's office, filled with towering stacks of books and the scent of old paper, a sanctuary of knowledge and ethics. He would be her first ally, the key to unlocking the resources she desperately needed: access to legal databases, academic journals, and the network of ethical lawyers who stood in opposition to men like Finch. She would need to lay out the entire story, from her father's ruin to the confrontation in the restaurant, connecting the dots that had remained separate for so long. It was a story of profound personal pain, but she would present it as a legal case, stripping it of emotion and focusing on the cold, hard facts of securities fraud and corporate malfeasance. Alistair Finch, at that very moment, was likely preening, basking in the restored order of his world, having successfully crushed a minor annoyance. He would be telling the story to his analyst, framing it as a necessary lesson in discipline, in putting the lower classes back in their place. He would sleep soundly that night in his penthouse apartment, cocooned in the ignorant bliss of the untouchable. He would have no idea that miles away, a woman he had dismissed as utterly insignificant was taking the first step in a long, methodical journey to dismantle his entire world. He had built his empire on the assumption that his victims were powerless and silent. He had never considered the possibility that one of them might have a perfect memory and a law degree from Columbia. Finally, the ringing stopped, and a familiar voice, older and raspier than she remembered, came through the line. "Elara, is that really you?" The surprise in Professor Albright's voice was palpable, but it was quickly followed by a tone of genuine warmth and concern. There was no judgment, no "I told you so," only the open door of a mentor who had never given up on his star pupil. Elara took a deep breath, the cold city air filling her lungs and steadying her nerves. "Professor," she said, her own voice clear and strong, a voice he would recognize from his most advanced seminars, "I need your help. I believe I have a case, a very big case. And I need to know everything there is to know about a man named Alistair Finch." The war had begun. The office of Professor Albright was less a room and more a monument to the printed word, a sanctuary where the weight of centuries of legal precedent felt like a physical presence. The air was thick with the scent of aging paper, worn leather, and the faint sweet aroma of his pipe tobacco, a smell Elara associated with intellectual safety and rigorous debate. Sunlight, filtered through the dusty panes of a large Gothic window overlooking the campus green, struggled to pierce the gloom, illuminating swirling dust motes that danced like tiny, forgotten spirits. Books were not merely stored here. They were stacked in precarious, gravity-defying towers on every available surface: the floor, the chairs, the wide mahogany desk, leaving only a small, fiercely defended clearing for work. It was a landscape of knowledge, a physical manifestation of a mind dedicated to the labyrinthine complexities of the law, and for Elara, stepping back into it felt like a homecoming and a haunting all at once, a return to a life she had been forced to abandon. Professor Albright, a man whose tweed jacket seemed a natural extension of his own rumpled, thoughtful demeanor, watched her with eyes that missed nothing. They were kind eyes, but they were also the sharp, analytical eyes of a lawyer who had spent 40 years dissecting corporate malfeasance. He listened without interruption as Elara recounted the entire sordid tale, her voice low and steady, stripping the story of its raw emotion, and presenting it as she would have in one of his seminars. A sequence of events, a breach of ethics, a potential violation of federal law. He did not react with shock or pity. Instead, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on a small pile of legal journals, and when she finished, he remained silent for a long moment, the only sound the soft ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. He was not just hearing her story, he was analyzing its legal architecture, testing its foundations, searching for the load-bearing walls that could support the weight of a full-scale assault against a man like Alistair Finch. He finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to emanate from the very core of the room's academic gravity. "Alistair Finch," he said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "He is not just a shark, Alara. He is a leviathan. He has built an empire on the bones of good companies and good people. His legal team is a fortress, designed to crush lawsuits before they are even filed. To go after him is not just to pick a fight, it is to declare war on a sovereign nation of wealth and influence." He let the warning hang in the air, a final test of her resolve. He needed to know that she understood the sheer scale of the battle she was proposing, that this was not a quest born of fleeting anger, but of an unshakable, cold-burning conviction. He was offering her an out, a chance to walk away before the first shot was fired, before the full might of Finch's world was brought to bear against her. Ilara met his gaze without flinching, the fire he had first seen in her as a student now burning with a controlled, terrifying intensity. "I know," she replied, her voice unwavering. "But he made a mistake. He made two, in fact. First, he told me his strategy, believing I was too insignificant to understand it. Second, he told it to the one person on Earth whose life he had already destroyed with that exact strategy. He delivered the weapon and the motive directly into my hands. This is not just a war. One I'm willing to fight, Professor. It is a case I am obligated to prosecute." The conviction in her voice was absolute, leaving no room for doubt. She was no longer his student seeking guidance. She was a colleague proposing a plan of action, a fellow officer of a court of justice that existed beyond the marble halls of the judiciary, in the realm of fundamental right and wrong. Albright saw the transformation was complete. The grieving daughter and the weary waitress had receded, leaving behind the brilliant legal mind he had always known was there. A slow smile spread across the old professor's face, a smile of profound, weary satisfaction. "Very well then," he said, rising from his chair with a new energy. "Let's give you your armory." He led her to a computer terminal in the corner of the office, a modern intrusion in the analog world of books. With a series of clicks, he bypassed the student-level access and logged into the university's deepest archives, a digital treasure trove that was the modern equivalent of the Library of Alexandria for legal and financial scholars. "You now have full faculty-level access to everything," he explained, his voice taking on the familiar tone of a lecturer. "LexisNexis, Westlaw, Bloomberg terminal data, every SEC filing, every corporate report, every archived news article going back 50 years, it's all here. It is a mountain of data, a blizzard of information. Finch will be buried in there somewhere. Your job is to find him." He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "And you will not be entirely alone. I will make some quiet inquiries. There are people who owe me favors, old friends at the SEC. Journalists who have been trying to pin something on Finch for years. We will start by building the case file from the ground up." The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and caffeine-fueled days, a monastic existence dedicated to a single, all-consuming purpose. Alara's tiny one-bedroom apartment, once a place of quiet grief and exhaustion, transformed into the war room for her campaign against Alistair Finch. The walls, previously bare except for a single faded photograph of her parents, were now covered in a complex spiderweb of documents, printouts, and handwritten notes connected by colored yarn. Corporate structures of Vulture Capital and its myriad shell companies, timelines of acquisitions, profiles of key executives. It was a visual representation of a hidden empire, a conspiracy chart made real. The air grew thick with the smell of laser printer toner and microwaved coffee. the scent of a relentless, obsessive pursuit. Sleep became a luxury she could not afford, a brief and troubled intermission in a continuous cycle of research, analysis, and cross-referencing. The outside world, with its sunlight and casual conversations, ceased to exist. Her reality was the glowing screen of her laptop and the mountain of paper that threatened to consume her small living space. She began her investigation not with her father's company, but with the one Finch had boasted about at the restaurant, the acquisition he had used as a tool for his cruel lesson. She dissected that deal with a forensic passion, using it as a case study to understand his methodology. She spent days immersed in the minutiae of the tender offer, the proxy statements, the Schedule 13D filings he had so arrogantly mentioned. She was not just reading them, she was deconstructing them, searching for the ghost in the machine, the telltale signs of his predatory tactics. She found a pattern, a repeatable signature of his operations: the use of offshore entities to quietly accumulate shares, the strategic release of negative press to drive down the target's stock price, the generous severance packages for key board members who might otherwise have resisted the takeover. It was a symphony of corporate violence, conducted with ruthless precision and cloaked in a veneer of legality. Each discovery was a small victory, a piece of the puzzle clicking into place, but it was also a fresh wave of pain. In the cold, impersonal language of the financial documents, she saw the echoes of her own family's tragedy. Every mention of restructuring and synergies was a euphemism for lives dismantled and dreams destroyed. She saw her father in the faces of the other CEOs who had been forced out, other innovators whose creations had been strip-mined for profit. This was not just business, it was a form of predation, and Alistair Finch was the apex predator. The work was emotionally grueling, forcing her to relive her trauma again and again, but with each new file she opened, her resolve hardened. The grief that had once been a paralyzing weight was now being forged into a weapon, its mass and density focused into a single, sharp point aimed directly at the heart of Finch's empire. After establishing his methods, she turned the full force of her investigation to the takeover of Innovate Dynamics. She pulled every available document related to the acquisition of her father's company by the shell corporation, Apex Holdings. The official record was clean, meticulously scrubbed by Finch's army of lawyers. On the surface, it was a textbook example of a successful, if aggressive, acquisition. The filings were all in order, the timelines met, the disclosures made. It was a legal fortress, just as Professor Albright had warned. For a full week she hit a brick wall, a carefully constructed facade of legitimacy that seemed impenetrable. Frustration began to gnaw at her, a cold tendril of doubt that whispered she was on a fool's errand, that men like Finch were too powerful, too protected, to ever be brought to justice by something as flimsy as the truth. In a moment of near despair, late one night when the city outside was finally quiet, she stared at the photograph of her parents. Her father was smiling, his arm around her mother, his eyes bright with the fierce intelligence and kindness that had defined him. She remembered his passion for his work, not for the money it could make, but for the problems it could solve, for the elegant beauty of a perfectly written line of code. He had built his company to create things, not to conquer them. Finch had not just taken a business, he had desecrated a life's work, a philosophy. A fresh surge of anger, pure and clarifying, burned away the fog of her exhaustion. She would not be beaten by a wall of paper. If the front door was barred, she would find another way in. She had to think like Finch, to look for the cracks not in what was there, but in what was missing. The breakthrough came not from a complex financial statement, but from a simple, mundane document, an appendix to a quarterly report filed by Apex Holdings 6 months after time the acquisition. It was a list of asset write-downs, a routine piece of corporate accounting. She had scanned it a dozen times before, dismissing it as irrelevant. But this time, fueled by a new perspective, she looked closer. Buried deep within the list of depreciated office equipment and old servers was a single line item that made her breath catch in her throat. Intellectual Property Asset 7B, Project Chimera, value written down to 0. Project Chimera. It was her father's secret project, a revolutionary piece of software he believed would change the industry. the very heart of his company's future value. It was the reason for his refusal to sell, the crown jewel he was protecting. A cold dread washed over her as the implications of that single line became clear. Finch hadn't bought Innovate Dynamics to develop its technology. He had bought it to kill it. Project Chimera must have posed a direct threat to another, larger company in his portfolio. The hostile takeover wasn't about profit. It was about eliminating a competitor, but the official valuation documents filed during the takeover, the ones used to justify the lowball offer to shareholders, had listed the company's intellectual property at a fraction of its true worth. If she could prove that Finch knew the real value of Project Chimera while publicly undervaluing it, she would have him on securities fraud. It was the smoking gun, the irrefutable proof of his criminal intent. The wall had not been impenetrable. It had simply been hiding the crime in plain sight, buried in the boring language of accounting. The problem remained, however, of how to prove what Finch knew. The official records would be sanitized. She needed something from the inside, a voice from behind the curtain. Her mind raced, sifting through the names of the people involved in the takeover. The board members of her father's company had all been forced out, made to sign ironclad non-disclosure agreements. But what about the people below them? The managers, the accountants, the people who had processed the paperwork and knew where the bodies were buried. Professor Albright, using his discreet network, managed to track down the former chief financial officer of Innovate Dynamics, a man named Marcus Thorne. He had been a close friend of her father's, a man of integrity who had fought the takeover until the very end, before being unceremoniously fired and replaced by one of Finch's cronies. Finding Marcus was one thing, convincing him to talk was another. He was living a quiet, diminished life in a small town in upstate New York, working as a high school accounting teacher. The fire he once had was gone, replaced by a deep-seated fear. When Ilara finally met him in a small, roadside diner that smelled of stale coffee and regret, he was a ghost of the confident executive she remembered from her childhood. His hands trembled as he held his coffee cup, and he refused to make eye contact for the first 10 minutes of their conversation. Finch had not just taken his job, he had broken his spirit, threatening him with financial ruin and blacklisting him from the industry if he ever spoke a word about the takeover. He was terrified, a man living in the long shadow of a corporate tyrant. Ilara did not press him or appeal to his sense of anger. Instead, she spoke quietly about her father. She described his condition, the way his brilliant mind was now trapped, the daily struggle to pay for his care. She spoke not of revenge, but of legacy. She told Marcus that this was not about punishing Finch, but about restoring the truth of what her father had built, about honoring the integrity of the company they had both loved. She slid a single document across the sticky vinyl tabletop, a copy of the asset write-down, with the line about Project Chimera highlighted. "I know they lied about the valuation, Marcus," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I just need you to tell me how. You were the only one who truly knew what that project was worth." His eyes fixated on the highlighted text, and for the first time a flicker of the old fire returned. He stared at it for a full minute, the sounds of the diner fading away as he was transported back to the darkest days of his professional life. He remembered the arguments in the boardroom, the threats from Finch's lawyers, the sickening feeling of watching a great company being deliberately dismantled. He looked up at Ilara, at the face of his old friend's daughter, and saw the same unyielding integrity that had defined her father. The fear in his eyes was still there, but it was now competing with a different emotion, a long dormant sense of duty. He finally took a deep, shuddering breath, a man making a decision to step back into the light after years in the shadows. "They didn't wipe the internal servers properly," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They thought they did, but there was an off-site archival backup, a legacy system the tech team kept for disaster recovery. They wouldn't have known about it. The valuation models, the internal memos, the real projections for Project Chimera, it should all be there." He then scribbled a string of characters on a napkin, an old server address, and an administrative password he had never forgotten. "I can't testify," he said, his voice trembling again. "He'll destroy me. But this, "This is for your father." He pushed the napkin across the table, a small, flimsy key to a kingdom of buried secrets. It was everything Alara needed. It was the map that led directly to the heart of Finch's crime. Armed with this new information, Alara enlisted the help of a cybersecurity graduate student recommended by Professor Albright, a young woman who viewed cracking into archaic corporate servers as a moral imperative. They worked for 2 straight days, fueled by pizza and a shared sense of righteous purpose. The student navigated the labyrinth of the old system while Alara directed her, telling her exactly what to look for, the specific date ranges and keywords that would yield the evidence she needed. The tension in the small apartment was electric, a mixture of hope and anxiety. They were dancing on a digital razor's edge. At any moment, their intrusion could be detected, their one chance at the truth gone forever. Then, late on the second night, they found it. Not just a single memo, but an entire email chain. A series of messages between Alistair Finch himself and his head of acquisitions. The words on the screen glowed with a sickening, triumphant light. In cold, clear, unambiguous language, Finch and his subordinate discussed the threat posed by Project Chimera. They explicitly laid out their strategy: to acquire Innovate Dynamics for the sole purpose of shutting it down, to intentionally suppress its valuation during the tender offer to avoid alerting competitors, and to bury its most valuable asset in accounting write-downs. It was a complete, unvarnished confession, a step-by-step blueprint of their fraud, preserved forever in the digital amber of a forgotten server. Alara stared at the screen, a profound, chilling calm settling over her. The frantic energy of the search was gone, replaced by the grim certainty of a prosecutor who had just been handed an airtight case. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. She had him. She had the irrefutable, undeniable proof that would not just expose him but would utterly destroy him. The emails were a testament to his hubris, to his belief that he was so far above the law that he could commit his crimes in writing, confident that his power would forever shield them from the light of day. He had never accounted for the possibility of a forgotten server, and he had certainly never accounted for the relentless, brilliant daughter of the man he had so casually destroyed. She printed the emails, the pages warm from the laser printer. She held the documents in her hands, the paper feeling as heavy and substantial as a stone tablet of commandments. This was it. The hunt was over. All the sleepless nights, the moments of despair, the years of quiet suffering had led to this single, victorious moment. Her gaze drifted across her cluttered apartment and landed on a discarded newspaper on her coffee table. On the front page of the Society section was a glossy photograph of Alistair Finch, smiling his predatory smile. The headline announced that he would be the keynote speaker at the annual Metropolitan Philanthropy Gala, an exclusive event for the city's financial elite, where he would be speaking on the topic of ethical capitalism. A slow, cold smile touched Ilara's lips. He was not just going to give a speech, he was going to a public execution. The stage was set, the evidence was in her hands, and the prosecutor was ready. The grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum of Art was a universe unto itself, a constellation of human stars gathered under a ceiling painted to resemble a celestial heaven. The air was a heady concoction of expensive perfume, the subtle minerality of vintage champagne, and the electric hum of immense concentrated wealth. Light from chandeliers the size of small automobiles fractured through a sea of diamonds and sapphires, painting the faces of hedge fund managers and their elegantly curated wives in strokes of brilliant, cold fire. Conversations were a low, controlled murmur, the currency of this room not just money but information, influence, and the carefully maintained illusion of effortless power. Into this glittering galaxy, Ilara Vance walked not as a guest, but as an astronomer, an observer armed with a telescope of truth, ready to reveal that one of the brightest stars in the firmament was, in fact, a black hole, consuming everything around it. She wore a simple, dark blue dress, a garment of such understated elegance that it acted as a form of camouflage, allowing her to move through the glittering throng unnoticed. It was not a costume, but a uniform, the armor of a professional about to enter the courtroom of public opinion. Beneath the calm exterior, her heart beat a steady, resolute rhythm, a war drum counting down the final moments to a battle she had spent months preparing for. Alistair Finch took the stage to a wave of thunderous, reverential applause. He stood at the podium, bathed in the warm glow of a single spotlight, a modern-day emperor addressing his Senate. He was the very picture of philanthropic grace, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his tuxedo tailored with surgical precision. He smiled a wide, practiced smile that did not reach his cold reptilian eyes. He placed his hands on the sides of the lectern, a gesture of feigned humility, and began to speak. His topic, Ethical Capitalism, a New Paradigm for a New Century, was a masterpiece of Orwellian doublespeak. He spoke of responsibility, of sustainability, of giving back to the society that had given him so much. Each word was a polished lie, a smooth, seductive stone dropped into the placid pool of his audience's willful ignorance. Watching from the back of the room, Alara felt no anger, only a profound, chilling clarity. She saw not a man, but a construct, a hollow effigy of success built upon the unseen, uncounted wreckage of other people's lives. The image of her father's face, etched with a confusion he could no longer articulate, flashed in her mind, not as a wound but as a whetstone, sharpening her focus to a razor's edge. Finch was not just giving a speech, he was delivering his own eulogy, and he was the only person in the room who did not know it. The speech concluded, and the room erupted once more in a sustained, sycophantic ovation. Finch nodded, accepting the adoration as his due, a sun king absorbing the light of his fawning planets. A polished, television-ready moderator joined him on stage for the Q&A session, her smile as bright and artificial as the stage lighting. The first few questions were softballs, lobbed from friendly sources in the front rows, inquiries about market forecasts and his foundation's latest charitable endeavors. Finch answered them with a practiced, easy charm, reinforcing his image as a benevolent visionary. Alara remained still, a statue of patience at the edge of the crowd. She let the rhythm of the event establish itself, let the audience settle into a comfortable state of passive admiration. She felt the weight of the printed emails in her clutch, the crisp edges of the paper, a tangible link to the undeniable truth she was about to unleash. Her breathing was slow and even, her body a vessel of pure, focused intent. This was not an act of passion or revenge. It was a legal maneuver, a strategic deposition being conducted in the most public forum imaginable. She was waiting for the perfect moment, the precise instant when a single, well-aimed question could shatter the entire grand illusion. The moderator scanned the room. "One final question?" she asked, her voice lilting. Alara's hand went up. It was not a frantic, attention-seeking gesture, but a single, deliberate movement that somehow cut through the visual noise of the room. Perhaps it was the stillness that preceded it, or the sheer, unadorned confidence of the motion. But the moderator's eyes found her. A young attendant with a wireless microphone materialized at her side. As Alara took the microphone, a subtle shift occurred in the room's atmosphere. The low murmur of side conversations quieted. The spotlight, still focused on Finch, seemed to cast a new, harsher glare. Finch squinted slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features as he tried to place this unknown woman in a simple, dark dress. He saw no one of importance, no one from his world. His posture relaxed into one of dismissive indulgence. Alara lifted the microphone, the cool metal, a conduit for the storm she was about to break. "Mr. Finch," she began, her voice perfectly amplified, clear and calm and carrying an authority that instantly commanded the attention of every person in that ballroom. "My name is Alara Vance. 3 years ago, you acquired a small software company called Innovate Dynamics through a shell corporation named Apex Holdings. You did so for the sole purpose of killing its flagship product, Project Chimera, to protect a larger investment. To achieve this, you deliberately and criminally undervalued the company's intellectual property in your tender offer to its shareholders. My question is that the kind of ethical capitalism you were referring to in your speech? The silence that descended upon the ballroom was absolute, a physical entity that was heavier and more profound than any sound. It was the silence of 100 multimillionaires simultaneously holding their breath, the silence of a carefully constructed reality shattering into a million pieces. Alistair Finch's face, which had been a mask of benevolent power, seemed to melt under the heat of her words. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of genuine uncomprehending confusion crossed his eyes. Innovate Dynamics? The name was a ghost from a minor, forgotten conquest. Then, as he truly looked at her, at the unwavering intensity of her gaze, a dawning, horrified recognition began to seep into his consciousness. He saw her not as the woman from the gala, but as the waitress from the gilded cage, the insignificant speck of dust who had dared to challenge him. The connection clicked into place with the sickening finality of a guillotine blade dropping. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, pallid sheen. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out, only a dry, rasping gasp. The moderator, her professional smile frozen in a rictus of panic, looked between Finch and Ilara, utterly lost. Ilara did not wait for his answer. She had not come for a debate. She had come to deliver a verdict. Reaching into her clutch, she pulled out the stack of printed emails. For the benefit of the members of the press in the room, she continued, her voice never wavering, I have here copies of internal emails, sent by Mr. Finch himself, in which he and his acquisitions team lay out this exact strategy in clear, unambiguous detail. In these documents he refers to the founder of Innovate Dynamics, my father, as a sentimental fool who needed to be cleared out of the way. He outlines the plan to purchase his life's work simply to bury it. This was not business. This was a premeditated and fraudulent act of corporate vandalism, a direct violation of Section 10B of the Securities Exchange Act. The clicking of camera shutters started, at first a few scattered pops, then a furious machine gun-like volley. The journalists, smelling the biggest corporate scandal of the decade, surged forward, their faces a mixture of predatory glee and disbelief. Every phone in the room was now raised, recording, broadcasting the immolation of Alistair Finch to the entire world. Ilara placed the papers on an empty chair beside her, a public offering of evidence. Her work was done. Finch stood paralyzed at the podium, a statue of crumbling arrogance. The carefully constructed persona of the philanthropist, the visionary, the master of the universe, had been stripped away in less than 90 seconds, revealing the petty, fraudulent tyrant beneath. He stared out at the sea of faces, his peers, his admirers, and saw not respect, but a cold, calculating reassessment. He saw the looks of investors mentally divesting, of board members creating distance, of rivals savoring his ruin. His empire was built on a foundation of perceived invincibility, and that foundation had just been turned to dust. A low, animalistic sound escaped his throat, a noise of pure, narcissistic rage and terror. He stumbled back from the podium, knocking over a glass of water, the sound of it shattering on the stage, a punctuation mark on his complete and utter collapse. Security guards began to move toward the stage, not to protect him, but to contain him. Ilara turned, without a backward glance, and began to walk away. She moved through the chaotic, buzzing crowd, an island of perfect calm in the center of a hurricane she had created. As she reached the grand marble exit, she could hear the first shouted questions from the reporters, a cacophony of accusation that would follow Alistair Finch for the rest of his life. She stepped out into the cool, clean night air, leaving the wreckage of his world burning behind her. Type "Justice" in the comments if you got chills when Ilara Vance finally exposed the truth. Weeks later, the world was a different place. The fall of Alistair Finch was a media spectacle, a daily drama of federal investigations, shareholder lawsuits, and the gleeful, merciless dissection of his ruined legacy. Vulture Capital imploded, its assets frozen, its partners scattering like rats from a sinking ship. But Ilara took no joy in the spectacle. She had not sought destruction, only accountability. She spent her days where she was needed most, at the quiet, sunlit care facility where her father now lived. One afternoon, as she sat reading to him, a man in a quiet, impeccably tailored suit approached them. He was older, with kind, observant eyes that held no hint of artifice. Ilara recognized him instantly as Mr. Davies, the notoriously private, almost mythical owner of the Gilded Cage. He had not come to apologize. He had come with a proposition. "I saw what happened that night," he said, his voice a quiet, respectful baritone. "On the security cameras. I also saw what happened at the gala. I have spent my life investing in companies. I believe it is time I started investing in people." He explained that he was launching a new impact investment fund, a firm dedicated to finding and funding ethical, innovative startups, the very kind of companies Finch had preyed upon. He was not offering her a job as a lawyer. He was offering her a full partnership to build and lead the fund's entire legal and ethical compliance division. 6 months later, Ilara Vance sat in an office that overlooked the same city that had once seemed so vast and indifferent. The office was not opulent, but it was filled with light, its walls covered not in abstract art, but in the business plans and schematics of hopeful, brilliant entrepreneurs. She was no longer a waitress, a victim, or a warrior. She was a builder, a guardian. She held in her hands a proposal for a new medical software company, one founded by a young woman whose passion and integrity reminded Ilara so much of her father. Her work was now to protect these dreams, to build a shield of legal and ethical fortitude around them, to ensure that they could grow without fear of predators like Alistair Finch. She had the power not just to seek justice for past wrongs, but to cultivate a future where those wrongs were less likely to occur. She had secured her father's future, providing him with the best care money could buy, but more importantly, she had redeemed his legacy. His belief in ethical innovation was no longer just a memory, it was the founding principle of her new life, a living, breathing force for good in the world. Her journey had not been one of revenge but of reclamation. She had reclaimed her voice, her power, and the future that had been stolen from her. The world of men like Alistair Finch was built on the cynical belief that dignity was a commodity and that justice was a luxury. Ilara had proven that dignity was a shield and that justice, when wielded with intelligence and unwavering truth, was the most powerful weapon of all. She looked out the window at the endless expanse of New York City, no longer seeing a gilded cage of power and exclusion, but a garden of possibilities. She was no longer the invisible servant cleaning up after the titans. She was the one who tended the soil, who nurtured the growth, who ensured that the best and brightest ideas had a chance to reach for the sun. The silence of her past had finally been filled, not with the noise of battle, but with the quiet, satisfying hum of purpose, a purpose forged in fire and dedicated to the light. If Ilara Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.